Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, a starving artist crawling on the floor under the baronet's table like Leporello in Don Giovanni by Mozart, scrounging for interstellar scraps. Here to talk to you today about, well, whatever the hell I want, because I am ahead for once, and so I'm departing from my usual habit of talking about the transits, and instead I'm going to talk more loosely about Saturn and what a vital part he plays in the creative process. Now, you'll often hear me refer to Saturn as a craftsman in these videos. A craftsman is an architect, somebody who constructs something solid and tangible that undeniably exists in the world. He is distinguished from a dreamer who may be happy to live endlessly in the ethereal, never-ending realms of cocaine and the Akashic records, and feel quite comfortable drifting through that void of infinite images without ever thinking, I need to take one of these from the realm of infinity and give birth to it and give it form, because the dreamer is usually an idealist and he finds the dazzling, scintillating revelation of his inner visions endlessly more attractive and pleasant than the inevitable disappointments, shortcomings, and restrictions of anything that we do give physicalized life. But the craftsman is someone who has learned to be a mediator between the realm of dreams and the realm of forms. He's someone who can have these insights, these flashes, these floods of inspiration, these toffee-coloured love letters from his own private muse, and can say, okay, what I'm seeing there is born of non-Euclidean geometry. It is beautiful, it is sparkling, but it is also impossible because it is a dream, and therefore can be constructed of many more dimensions than I am capable of working with these all too mortal, tangible fingers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out a way of translating something that is beyond space and time, beyond form, beyond dimensionality, and find a way of reconciling it with the physical world. Find a way of taking that endless circle that has no circumference and turning it into a square, squaring the circle, ladies and gentlemen. That is the craftsman's great magic trick. For many people, Saturn can be both a helper and a hindrance, because he is capable of being the midwife of our dreams, but also the devourer of them. Saturn is a realist. He is practical, he is patient, and he is hard-working. But if we have not learnt to befriend him, if we have not learnt to tame his worst points, he can also be pessimistic, too critical. He can be the part of us that looks at any idea, dream, vision that we have and can tear it to pieces before it's even been born. It can say, well, that's not realistic, that's got to go, that could be improved on, that needs work. And if we haven't learned to tame that part of our Saturn, then all of our ideas end up being devoured. We end up saying, well, there's no point me giving birth to or attempting that thing, because either it's going to be too much hard work for too little fructification, or it's just never going to turn out the way I've envisaged it. So I might as well stick with something that is within reach. But to some people, that hypercritical Saturnine voice can be so extreme that almost nothing feels within reach. Everything feels just too far away from us, like Tantalus reaching for the grapevine hovering above his waters of endless punishment. But Saturn, the practical voice of Saturn, can be a great helper in just getting us engaged with the creative process, because he can be honest about the degree to which we can fulfill or manifest a particular vision of ours. he is the part of us that accepts that anything that we try and reproduce in some kind of physical, tangible, or sensually appreciable form is going to have its shortcomings. There are going to be bits that have to be left out because we are creating something finite. We cannot create the infinite because the infinite already exists and we are a part of it. Anything that we create has to have its limits, have to have a place where the frame stops and the rest of reality intrudes again. And that means that one of the ultimate lessons we have to accept in any creative process is that something does not have to be perfect in order for us to reach it out there in the world. It just has to be good enough. It has to bear some resemblance to what it inherently is. And if it manages to look more or less like it is, it doesn't matter if it isn't this hyper-real portrait that manages to incorporate anything. So long as it has incorporated something, so long as there is at least some vestige and shadow and trace of that supernal vision that other people are capable of witnessing and deriving something from, then it is good enough. And Saturn can look at it, and he can look at it endlessly and say, well, I could improve this, I could do that, I could polish it here, I could trim it there. But it could do that endlessly, and at some point it has to know when to stop, otherwise it will never go anywhere. I would definitely say, as a creative person myself, learning to be more practical and detached about my visions and sources of inspiration has been one of the biggest leaps forward I've made in terms of being more productive and prolific. Because I think one of the dangers sometimes we experience as artists or creative people is that we identify so strongly with our output, with the brain children that we bring forth into the world, that we can end up being overly precious about them because we feel that we are giving a part of ourselves. And just as in the same way that a parent can over-identify with a child, but ultimately as they develop as parents have to appreciate that their child is not forever attached to them via an invisible umbilical cord, but has to go out into life and find their own identity. It's the same with our works of art. There is a point for which we also have to snip the umbilical cords of anything we've made and said, I have parented you as much as I can, I've dressed you, I've watched you, I've nourished you with my own two teats. You've had everything you can possibly get from me. Now you've got to go out into the world and face whatever it chooses to confront you with. And I think it's worth remembering that before he got overthrown and imprisoned either in Tartarus or in one of the Blessed Isles, depending on which myth you look at, Saturn was the king of the gods before Zeus. He ruled over the golden age in which life was abundant and people were long-lived and everything was a paradise. But his fall was precipitated by the fact that he refused to believe or accept that this golden age would end, because he received a prophecy that just as he overthrew his father Uranus and castrated him and gave birth to the next race of gods, he was told that his own children would also one day usurp and overthrow him. And that's why we have that famous painting by Goya of Saturn eating his own children with such lusty and wild abandon. But he committed these vile acts of infantophagia because he was so fixated with this vision of paradise, this worldly paradise that he had created, that he couldn't accept the fact that it might decay or atrophy or become something lesser or become something that he would lose control over. And I think it's the same with us, that if we become too obsessively addicted to our own visions and own dreams, and we won't allow them to be compromised or meddled or tampered with in any way, then we are like Saturn devouring our own children. We're saying every child I give birth to is too ugly, too twisted, too warped, too differing and dissonant to the perfect image I have in my mind. So I'm just going to keep destroying them and hoping that the next child I give birth to is worthy of my genius, rather than accepting that these things are coming from me, and there are always going to be imperfections in anything I produce. And if I just keep devouring and destroying everything I produce, then I'm depriving myself of my own fertility. I'm setting fire to my own crops. I am destroying the very flowers that I have planted in the ground because I can't accept them for what they are. I just keep being haunted by the vision of what they could be, and at some point I have to face the reality of what they are, and that is what Saturn is about. Seeing something and learning to accept it maturely for what it is, instead of endlessly berating it for what it could be. Accepting that everything has its own essential qualia, its own basic quintessence, and that part of being mature and wise and stoical is learning to accept that essence rather than constantly feeling the need to mutilate and mangle it until we feel it is what it should be, until it conforms to our own great narcissistic godly thou shalts. But Saturn is also a slow mover. In the medieval universe, before the other outer planets had been discovered, he was the slowest moving celestial body in the sky. Because whereas Mercury flies along at mercurial pace, and the moon has her monthly rhythms, that the Venus has more or less an annual cycle, and Jupiter spends about a year in every sign. For Saturn, it's about 2.5 years. So compared to all the other gods of the medieval pantheon, he was perceived as being limping along behind, and that's why Saturn in ancient mythologies often was depicted as being lame or crippled in some way, or having reversed feet, or being kind of ugly and dwarfish and misshapen. Because he symbolized the slow processes of what it actually takes to create something. The actual creation can be very time-consuming. That, like an architect building a house, some visions can only be realized by allowing things to be built up slowly, brick by brick. They aren't these things that can suddenly be snapped into being overnight. They take wearisome toil and labor. And they use the image of the hunchback or lame blacksmith, because in the early days of being a blacksmith, of being this strange magician and shaman who is able to take base metals and turn them into gleaming amulets or beautiful weapons and swords, you often had to work with chemicals and poisons that were highly toxic. So being a blacksmith in the past was deeply injurious to one's health. And it was almost this saturnine trade-off of saying, I will trade my own personal beauty and well-being in order to produce something in the world that is more beautiful than I ever feel I could be myself. And this isn't that different to what it is like to be an actual biological parent, where the labor and the toil and the constant stress and hardship and duty and responsibility of looking after beings that you have created is going to place extra burdens and stresses upon your physical organism than if you haven't chosen to do it. And for many people, they will say that yes, all those sleepless nights, all those long periods of stress, all of that extra time scrounging, trying to make ends meet so that I can give my children the life that I want to give them and that I feel they deserve, are worth it for bringing these children into being, for allowing one age to gradually decay and fertilize the next generation. One of the legends of Saturnine gods that I find most inspiring is the story of Hephaestus, because in some ways he does represent this Capricornian rags to riches, but riches on a very compromised level that is so expressive of the journey of Saturn and Capricornian virtues, where if we put in a lot of hard labor, we can bear the fruits of that, and yet we will always have to accept the limits of whatever we've worked for and how much it can actually fulfill us. You know, Saturn is ruled by his sense of weakness, his sense of inferiority, by what he feels he is deprived by on a core level, and will spend a lot of his life working hard to try and remedy that lack, and yet also has to accept that on some level there is only so much nourishment that his hard work can make up and compensate for. But anyway, on with the legend of Hephaestus, who was born to Zeus and Hera. The problem was, when Hephaestus was born, he was an ugly baby. Now, personally, I think almost all babies are ugly, but let's just say he was especially ugly. And this is not something that is acceptable to this race of gods. Zeus and Hera and their Olympian pantheon were not an all-inclusive abode of the gods. If you were going to be with them, you had to be one of the elite. You had to be one of the glitterati. You had to be sparkling and glamorous, witty like Hermes, or possessed of an otherworldly magic and charisma like Dionysus. You couldn't be ugly and squalid. Mortals were ugly, but not gods. What right did this hideous baby have to be here? And so they cast him down to the planet Earth, where some of us have been known to reside. I've been known to visit there myself on occasion, sometimes also when the gods have punished me and cast me down here from the heavenly heights. Anyway, he was cast down into the sea, but fortunately, rather than drowning, he was rescued by the sea goddesses Thetis and Euronymie, who looked after him, but also saw that in spite of his hideous appearance, which, being creatures of the sea, they're used to seeing, strange underwater species and monstrous fish. That's all the same level to them. There's different aesthetic standards in the sea, thank God, or thank goddesses. They could see that in spite of his lack of pulchritude, he did have a lot of skill and natural craftsmanship, that he had these wonderful fingers that had the capacity to produce truly beautiful things. And so they gave him his own private workshop and laboratory in which he could work these wonders for them and provide them with exquisite jewelry and other objets d'art of his harshly wrought craftsmanship. And one day, whilst Hera decided to hobnob with these goddesses, she noticed some of this beautiful jewelry, and she said, "Good heavens, where on earth did you get that brooch?" And they had to admit that Hephaestus, this son she had cast out as being unworthy of her, of being beneath her, actually made good, actually did something worthwhile. And this changed her tune completely. From having rejected Hephaestus, from having rejected this Saturnine god, she could see that given space, given time, and given the right encouragement, he was capable of producing things that were beautiful and worthy of being heralded and respected on Mount Olympus. And there's a lot of potent astrological symbolism to this myth, because Hera represents the moon. She was a moon goddess, and Zeus is Jove. He's Jupiter. And Jupiter likes things that are big, that are spectacular, that are boundless, that are limitless, that are visionary and inspiring. And the moon likes things that are comforting and safe and secure and nourishing. And so neither of them like Saturn very much on first meeting, because he looks so harsh and ugly and just plain mortal when they belong to these immortal realms. It doesn't look like he has anything to do with the beautiful world that they inhabit. And very often our Saturn, by house placement and aspect, can reveal parts of us that we feel are intrinsically ugly and unworthy and incapable and inferior, and parts of ourselves that are rough around the edges that we don't want other people to see. And yet it is the alchemical lead which, if we come to terms with our limitations and are willing to develop skills in areas where we feel inherently developed, can become, just like Hephaestus's great craftsmanship, a source of our own personal talent, because we have had to put so much work into it to make up for what it is that we feel that we lack or do not possess in that area. So when our visionary Jupiters see that Saturn is capable of earthing some of our visions and having the patience and craftsmanship to bring them into being, he starts looking at them a little differently. And likewise, the moon doesn't automatically like Saturn, because the hard work, the loneliness, the isolation, the separation that he represents is totally at odds with the cuddly, warm world in which she resides. And yet when she realizes that some of this loneliness, some of this maturity and adulthood that we have to accept in the world, that becoming oneself means being separate from other people in some way, when she accepts that that can produce a beauty and a comfort of its own right, she appreciates it. But these things take time. He was away from Mount Olympus 9 years before he was invited back. And it can take us equally long to come to terms with our own limitations and to accept that they are things that we can work with as things that give us definite parameters, rather than being something we endlessly have to mourn. Because childbirth and creativity are also analogous in that before a child is born, before it's given definite form, a parent can have an image of what their idealized child would be. I would like to have a daughter who would be like this. I would like to have a son who would be like that. In my own instance, my mother fantasized that one day she would have a son who would be big, buff and burly and go on to play rugby for Wales. Instead, she got a musical, astrological, psychological, transgender weirdo. So deviated a bit from the blueprints there, Mom. But that's it, is that when we are playing the parent to something we are bringing to being, we have to accept that our inspiration may have its own internal blueprint, its own idea of what it wants to be, and we are there to facilitate the process of it becoming into the world, rather than always having to stamp our ego upon it that has to accept that it is a vessel and a channel for inspiration rather than a direct product of it. That in allowing ourselves to be this bridge between the world of dreams and the world of forms, we are a translator of those images rather than the producer of them. And if we think about it like that, it is easier to divorce ourselves from the ego which wants to hold on to these things and say, see this? That was me, that was mine, I did this, and no one else, because I am great, I am God. Whereas really, all we can ever be truly is servants of the gods. And yet to be a humble servant of the gods isn't to inject our own muse and abilities with a little bit of magical godliness in the process. But the other point I was going to make about why creating something can be just as painful and as beset by agonizing birth pangs as actual labor and parturition can be, is because we are aware of everything that we have to chop up and throw away in order to create the vision in our head. You know, let's say you are a sculptor making a statue. You have just this raw block of marble or clay or whatever resource you want to label it as for the purpose of this allegory. And a lot of what you are attempting to carve, or a lot of what you are attempting to form, means getting rid of everything that is getting in the way of that form, and that a lot of your hard work ends up on the cutting room floor. You have to cut away everything that is not the form you are giving birth to. So in writing a sentence in a story, you are committing to one particular sentence when you could have written a million others. When you're writing a particular melody, you are in the process of giving birth to that melody, killing all the others that can no longer be in that specific space. So in order to permit something to take on a definite form, that means that all those other indefinite forms have to be aborted in the process. And for some very Neptunian or Jupiterian people, that is such a painful compromise that they would rather not produce anything at all. But eventually, to produce anything, we have to accept that it can only be one thing at a time. It can only be what it is. And part of the honor and the responsibility and the pride of a craftsman is to allow yourself to be a humble vehicle for that isness, for the essential quality of the thing that we have allowed ourselves to be a birth giver of. And one of the reasons I was thinking about Saturn today, more than usual, he's always there. Oh, he is always on my mind. He is always on my mind with his scythe and his rotting old bones. Is because Saturn is currently transiting my first house and also in opposition to my sun. So the idea of coming to terms with the limitation of what you can actually be and who you actually are is very much on my mind at the moment. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing Elvis badly again. I am a good singer, but it's not what these videos are about, people. You want to hear me sing? Well, my album will come out eventually. But yeah, to me, Saturn's journey through my first house is actually aligned with the time in which I came out as transgender and started to transition, so that my internal image of myself as a woman or some kind of feminine being could be translated into the world of forms. And the first house is related to our personal image, to that imago of the self that we project out into the world and want other people to see. And I think when Saturn is transiting through the first house, Saturn doesn't normally want to be seen. And yet part of Saturn going through the first house is him coming to terms with the fact that people are going to see you whether you like it or not, and they're going to see you for what you are. You might want to present this perfect glamorized vision, highly edited and softened around the edges version of yourself, which sometimes you can do when Neptune is going through the first, but when Saturn's there, it's like, no, people will see what they see, and you have to come to terms with the fact for being seen by that. And, trying to translate and transition is not something that happens overnight, and is still not happening overnight. It has been a painstaking process of trying to feminize myself as and become the woman I want to be, brick by brick. And a lot of that has meant chiseling away parts of me that are not truly me, that are things that I inherited from the collective or that I inherited from other people's expectations. And this is one of the ways in which Saturn can be both a helper and a hindrance, that before we learn to work with him benevolently and productively, because Saturn represents our insecurity, presents an area where we don't feel we can stand properly on our own without someone else's support, but that support is not forthcoming, we can often become a copycat in that area. We're like, oh shit, I can't do this. I'm not good enough at this. How do other people do this? And then we become mimics, and we'd be like, okay, well, someone does it like that. So if I want to be the best musician or the best dressmaker or the best artist or the best whatever, baker, any trade or profession you can name it, we can look at someone we do look up to who is an authority, a Saturnine authority figure in that area, and say, okay, well, that's how my hero, my teacher does it. I'm going to do it exactly the same. And yet the more we just while that teaches us basic skills, the more we just become copycats, the more we're upset and offended by anything we produce, because we can see that it possesses no I-ness, it possesses no uniqueness or authenticity of its own. It has the form, but it doesn't have that solar light, which Saturn's walls are meant to be a safe container for. And after just endlessly seeing how these lumps of clay we're producing are just have no life and vitality, eventually we realize I've got to stop just copying other people in that way and somehow allow what I'm producing to be a vehicle for my own individuality, and accept that that is enough, and that it can be enough even when it is experienced, warts and all. So chipping away the parts of me that I felt I've had to develop or become to suit someone's expectations of what I should be in the world, I've had to learn to chip away and then ask myself the vulnerable question of how do I want to be seen? What do I actually want to be? What persona do I actually want to be putting out into the world? And then the harder task of asking, well, how can I do that? And how much of that is actually possible? And there's a lot of trial and error in figuring that out, as there is with anything. And it's been such a painful process, because while Saturn would rather work behind the scenes and then produce something beautiful to the world and say ta-da, so that someone just sees the beautiful art form and not all the sweaty, ugly moments that it has taken to produce it, instead, transitioning for me has been like rehearsing live on stage every night and never knowing when you reach the final performance, when you know your fucking words and cues and entries, that I've had to be visible and learn to be comfortable being visible with a work of art, with a masterpiece I'm attempting to build, which isn't finished yet. And I don't know what it's going to look like when it's finished. Still don't really know what's possible. But that's what I mean about Saturn affecting the basic isness of something. Because that is authenticity. Authenticity isn't glowing and perfect and idealized. It is having the bravery and the humility just to let something be itself. And if that self is a bit paunchy, a bit smelly, if it has bad makeup and a rather confused dress sense, well, so be it. That's what it is right now, and it won't be any better until it is any better. And that takes time, patience, and hard work, and the willingness to detach your ego from total identification with the process of that thing. Because otherwise then we become too sensitive and wrathful, like Hera, who cannot accept that something is not beautiful straight away, and then we condemn it and we throw it below the earth and throw it back into that infinite collective. And maybe only later on realize what a precious jewel we have lost by throwing that sacred cornerstone away. Anyway, Saturn teaches us the wisdom of knowing when something is done, of knowing when it's finished. I think this is done now. Or maybe it isn't, because I also wanted to talk about my journey as an astrologer, the long years of studying and being very sensitive about sharing any of my knowledge with people, because I didn't think I was good enough, because I kept looking at other astrologers and other wisdom figures and other teachers and feeling like the only way to be a respectable teacher or astrologer is to be exactly like any of the writers or people that I look up to. And it was only when I could accept that no, I have to do things my own way, with my own talents, but also my own hang-ups and inabilities and insecurities in somewhere, and accept that I can't do anything, that there's always going to be gaps in my knowledge, that there are going to be many times when you lovely, lovely, beautiful, annoying people ask me things that I do not have the answer to, and having the humbleness to say, well, gee, I don't know the answer to that one. I could make one up, and my Sagittarius moon will make it sound awfully convincing. Or I could thank you and say thank you for showing me those areas where I still need to develop mastery. I'm going to go away, read a book on that subject very hastily, and hope that I can make up for it through the wisdom of experience. Anyway, if any of you have your own Saturnine journeys that you would like to share with me in terms of accepting your own creativity and also the areas of life in which you have had to learn to accept the limitations of something, even if that's meant offending your high ideals, I would love to hear about it. If you want to talk to me for advice or counselling, you can message me at starsunraveled@outlook.com. You can follow me on Instagram at astrology and underwear, and you can support me in my wearisome Hephaestus-like laboratory known as Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Stars Unraveled. Yes, I did almost belch then, but it's gone. I have devoured my own eructation. Never to be born again. Oh, what a cruel Saturnine parent I am, devouring my own smelly children. It's done. It's over. The hammer of the bell tolling has hit the anvil of my creativity, and I declare this video null and void.